Tonight, I invite you to imagine something simple. You sit beneath a dim candle, the wind taps gently on your window, and on the table in front of you is a single piece of bread. But it's not warm, not crusty, not golden. It's dense, cracked, gray, made from rye, maybe if you're lucky, but more likely it's mixed with ground bark, dust, and flour so coarse it feels like sand between your teeth. This is dinner. Yes, welcome to the real culinary world of the Middle Ages. In the modern world, we treat food as comfort, choice, even art. But in the 14th century, in the life of an ordinary European peasant, food was neither comfort nor pleasure. It was fuel, a daily gamble, a test of endurance. There was no refrigerator, no spice rack, no menu, and definitely no second servings. Breakfast, if it could be called, that a pot of watery porridge boiled barley, maybe oats, no meat, no salt, no sweetness. A mother kneels by the fire, stirring with a wooden spoon. 3 children stare at the pot like it's magic, but they know it isn't. It's just the same thing as yesterday. If the family is lucky, they might still have some old turnips stored from autumn. If they're really lucky, there's a single egg left from the chicken they haven't had to trade or eat. Meat, no. That's for weddings, burials, or saints' days. Otherwise, the pig in the pen is worth more alive than dead because it makes manure, not meals. The law of bread and the illusion of fairness. In 1266, England passed the Assize of Bread and Ale. It regulated the price and weight of bread in theory to protect the poor, but in reality bakers cheated. They mixed sawdust, chalk, sand, even ground bones to make dough stretch further. And if a baker was caught, they might be locked in a pillory with a moldy loaf tied around their neck as the crowd jeered and threw spoiled cabbage. Still, people kept buying it because bad bread was still bread. Food is survival, not satisfaction. It's hard to imagine from our modern kitchens filled with oils, herbs, and options, but in the medieval countryside, there were weeks when the question wasn't what to eat, but whether you'd eat at all. This wasn't fasting for fitness. This was hunger that whispered in your sleep and pinched behind your ribs. This was the kind of hunger you prayed through. The taste of power and who never got to taste it. Picture a kitchen, not yours. Not even one with a microwave or a pantry. This kitchen belongs to a merchant lord in 13th century Venice. And on the table, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, pepper. Exotic aromas fill the room, not because someone is cooking, but because someone is showing off. These spices are not seasoning. They are status, worth their weight in gold, or oxen. In the 11th century, a pound of nutmeg could cost as much as 7 fattened oxen. 7. To own it was to say, I am powerful enough to buy flavor. For most people, that kind of wealth was not just unreachable, it was unimaginable. To a peasant family, spices were not food, they were fables, things spoken of in the markets, things you might smell in the air when a noble wedding passed through the village square. Garlic, mustard, and vinegar, the people's pantry. So what did the rest of the world eat when they wanted flavor? They used what they had. Wild garlic for pungency, mustard seeds ground into paste, vinegar sharp, bitter, but reliable. It wasn't about taste. It was about making food less miserable. Bread so stale you had to soak it. Soup so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl. Even the best days weren't delicious. They were just edible. Salted, smoked, and hope it doesn't rot. Without refrigeration, meat was rare and risky. Even when peasants had it, they had to preserve it with salt expensive, smoke time consuming, drying weather dependent. None of these made meat taste better, only longer lasting. And sometimes, not long enough. People got sick, often, and nobody called it food poisoning. They just called it Wednesday. Class on a plate. While peasants were pickling onions and praying over old sausages, the nobility were feasting. A single banquet could feature whole roast peacocks redressed in their feathers, meat pies with cymbals baked into the crust, spiced wine, custard sweetened with imported sugar. For nobles, food was performance. For peasants, food was penance. Fasting, fermenting, and faking it, eating under pressure. Let's say you've managed to put something edible on the table. A piece of bread, a boiled root vegetable, maybe a shred of dried meat tucked into the stew. But then, the church bell rings, and suddenly it's forbidden. When God said no to dinner, throughout the Middle Ages, Christian doctrine wasn't just about prayer, it dictated what you ate and when. During Lent, a 40-day period of fasting meat was banned. For the rich, this meant getting creative fish molded into the shape of beef, almond milk custards, fake meats made from ground nuts and sugar. But for peasants, there was no game to play. They already had no meat. Now they had to give up eggs and dairy. 2. Hunger as holiness. For many, Lent wasn't a change, it was a deepening of the hunger they already lived with. The idea was, if you could suffer at the table, you could get closer to God, but for a mother with children to feed, this wasn't theology, it was terror. You knew the church was watching, neighbors were watching, and sometimes your own child would ask, why is God making me go hungry again? Pickle it or perish. Medieval food was a race against time, without refrigerators, ice boxes, or chemical preservatives. The only hope was salting, if you could afford it, pickling in vinegar or brine, fermenting like cabbage into sauerkraut, drying in the sun or smoke. These methods didn't just preserve food, they preserved survival. It was common to see vegetables hanging from rafters, jars bubbling in cool cellars, or bread hard enough to chip a tooth. Everything was a calculation. Cheating the system. Now, imagine being a baker. You have 10 hungry customers and only enough wheat for 5 loaves. What do? You cheat. Mix the flour with chalk. Blend in sand. Use moldy grains, scrape the top, and hope no one notices. Some added powdered bones or sawdust. It made the dough heavier and the stomach sicker. But the alternative, no sale, no supper, no survival. Laws, but no justice sure. There were rules. The assize of bread and ale. 13th century tried to set limits. But inspections were rare. Punishments, if they happened, were public and theatrical, pillories, beatings, and having your bad bread hung around your neck. And yet, people kept buying, because hunger has no morals. Banquets and bones. The theater of hunger. Not everyone in medieval Europe went to bed hungry. Not everyone soaked stale bread in weak ale. Some feasted. But not in the way you might think. Medieval nobility didn't just eat to live. They ate to perform. A table meant to impress. Step into a great hall. It's winter, but the fire blazes in a stone hearth large enough to roast a stag. The long oak table groans under the weight of golden-skinned roasted pigs. Platters of swan, redressed in feathers. Spiced sauces imported from the east. Pears poached in honeyed wine. Towering subtleties, edible sculptures shaped like castles, saints, or coats of arms. This wasn't dinner. This was spectacle. The price of flavor. To flavor these dishes, cooks used cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, saffron, sugar as rare and costly as silver. And because meat was such a staple for the noble table, it wasn't just cooked. It was layered game inside poultry, inside a pig, inside a cow. A grotesque art form of indulgence. But at what cost? The cook's men and women in soot-stained tunics toiled day and night. One mistake could mean humiliation, or worse. Their ingredients were precious, their labor invisible. They created abundance for those who would never know hunger, while their own families survived on scraps from the feast. Outside the walls, now shift the camera, pan away from the tapestries, out the window. There, in the snow, a boy watches through the cracks in the shutters. He smells roast goose, and at home, his mother is boiling cabbage water, again. What they ate, what they meant for the poor. Food was survival. For the rich, food was identity. You didn't just eat well, you showed it. You displayed it. Because in a world where 90% of people went hungry, luxury at the table was the ultimate sign of power. Thin soups and thinner hopes. When the food ran out, hunger was a fact of life in medieval times. But famine was something else. It came like a season, predictable in its cruelty, sudden in its silence. One year, the harvest failed. The next, the grain stores were empty. By spring, people were eating grass. A bad harvest wasn't just bad, it was deadly. A few weeks of bad rain meant no barley, no bread, no feed for the animals, no meat. And the cycle began. Children cried at night, mothers gave up their food, and fathers stared at muddy fields, praying for something green. Soup made of stones. It sounds like a folktale, but it wasn't. In famine years, peasants would boil tree bark, roots, weeds, shoe leather, even clay. They made soup to trick their children into feeling full. They chewed straw to suppress nausea. And when even that failed, they prayed for rain, or mercy, or death. Small kindnesses in the cold. But even in that bleak landscape, not everything was cruelty. Neighbors shared crusts, old women gave onions they couldn't eat to children who could, and churches, despite their hypocrisy, sometimes opened their grain stores. Not to everyone, but to some, and for those lucky enough to receive it, it wasn't just food, it was hope, the price of desperation. Still, hunger made people do things. They stole. They poached rabbits from the Lord's forest. They robbed bakeries. Some were caught, hung, flogged, starved to death in dungeons. But others escaped, blending back into the crowd, bread under their coat, guilt in their chest, and crumbs trailing behind them like a prayer. Rotten markets and rotted teeth. The city was no escape for the peasant. The city was a dream. More food, more trade, more chances to survive. But for those who made it behind the walls, the dream often turned sour. Literally, the market where hope smelled like fish. Imagine a medieval market street. Narrow, crowded, slick with mud and waste. You smell old meat, open barrels of vinegar, fish barely on the edge of spoiled, spices, but not to cook with, to mask the rot. Vendors shout, pigeons peck at crumbs beside rats. A man stirs a pot of something brown, offering it with a grin. You don't ask what's in it, you ask how much. A meal with a side of Plague City food wasn't just unclean, it was dangerous. Meat hung for days, bread molded by mid-morning. Ale turned sour within hours. And then there was the water. Most urban wells were polluted, so people drank beer not for pleasure, but survival. But brewers, like bakers, cut corners. Less barley, more water, spoiled grain, no fermentation time. You drank it anyway, because you were thirsty, and no one trusted the well. Deception was the rule. It wasn't about bad luck, it was business. Bakers mixed chalk into dough. Fishmongers rubbed salt on spoiled cod. Butchers sold dog meat as lamb. And if you got sick, you prayed or died. Because there was no regulation, no inspection, only hunger. Justice by the loaf. Sometimes a crook was caught. A baker might be fined, pilloried, chained with a fake loaf hung from his neck. But punishment didn't fix hunger. It only fed the crowd's anger. And after the shouting ended, the bread still ran out. Holy hunger, fasting, feasting, and faith. If anyone was supposed to eat with virtue, it was the monks. They lived in stone-walled silence, rose before sunrise, labored by hand, prayed by heart, and when it came to food, they fasted. But fasting didn't always mean what you think it did. When fasting was the rule, not the exception. In medieval Christianity, the calendar was ruled by two things: saints' days, fasting seasons. Lent alone lasted 40 days, Advent another 4 weeks, and dozens of smaller fasts filled the rest. On those days, meat was forbidden. But here's the twist: monks got creative. Fish that wasn't fish. To obey the rules, monks began reinterpreting them. Beaver tails counted as fish. Barnacle geese legends claimed they were born from driftwood, also fish. Whale meat, yep, also fish. And so, the fast became flexible. The monastery kitchen. Monasteries often had vast land-fertile fields, vineyards, fish ponds. Their kitchens were better stocked than many villages, and their recipes recorded in Latin, full of subtle spices and clever substitutions. But while the food was clever, the hunger was real. Monks still ate only twice a day, avoided meat, practiced silence at meals, shared everything, even scarcity. And during the harshest winters, they too knew the ache of hunger. Hunger is discipline. For some monks, hunger wasn't a burden, it was purification. Saint Benedict wrote that fasting cleansed the soul, that a thin body made for stronger prayer, that too much food dulled the mind. So they ate less, even when there was more, not out of poverty but principle. Her hands made the meal, women work and survival. In the stories of medieval food, men hunted, owned the land, and feasted in the great halls. But the hands that made the food, the ones that brewed the ale, salted the pork, kneaded the bread, they were often hers. The kitchen as her kingdom and her cage. Women weren't just cooks, they were survival artists. From dawn till dusk, they fetched water, pickled vegetables, hung herbs to dry, cared for hens and goats, baked bread over open hearths, managed what little grain was left. It wasn't glamorous, And it wasn't optional. A single mistake undersalted meat, moldy loaves, wasted milk could cost a family their winter rations. Alewives and the liquid lifeline. In many towns, ale was brewed by women known as alewives. They sold from their doorways. They wore tall hats so they could be seen from afar. They left a broom at the door, a sign ale was ready. It was beer, yes, but it was also safer than water, especially in towns. But success bred suspicion. Alewives were often fined for price deception, accused of dishonesty, mocked in literature, even linked to witchcraft. In time, the profession passed to men and the hats, brooms and brews. They stayed behind, as myth. Quiet queens of the hearth. In rural homes, it was the mother or eldest daughter who rationed. Who got the egg today? Whether the broth would be thin or thinner. When to save and when to share. No praise, no title, just repetition and resilience. The ones who foraged. When the pantry emptied, it was women who foraged. Nettles, mushrooms, sorrel, wild herbs and berries. They risked misidentification, illness, even death, but often returned with something. And in doing so, they kept the household alive. Little bellies, big burdens. Childhood hunger in the Middle Ages. When we picture childhood, we often think of innocence, play, discovery. But in the Middle Ages, childhood came with chores and hunger. A child's morning begins with work. By the time they were 5, most children had jobs. They fetched water from the stream, gathered sticks for firewood, watched the goats, picked weeds from gardens, drove geese to pasture, sorted beans and grains from dirt. It was their contribution not to the household income, but to keeping everyone from starving. And if they did well, maybe a little extra porridge at the end of the day. Eating last, eating less. In large families, the rule was simple. Children eat last. Fathers worked the hardest, they ate first. Mothers next, especially if nursing. Then, the older children, and finally, the littlest ones. By then, sometimes there was nothing left. No one cried, they'd learn not to. Just picked at the crumbs, chewed stale crust, and prayed tomorrow would be better. School was a luxury, unless it was monastic. Most peasant children didn't go to school, but some were sent to monasteries where food was regulated, meals were quiet, fasting was frequent, education was strict. For some, this was an escape. For others, just a colder form of hunger. When hunger was normal, one chronicler in the 14th century wrote of children who had never known the feeling of a full belly. They weren't starving, they just lived their lives with a constant low ache, a tightness, a quiet emptiness. And that feeling the absence of enough shaped how they saw the world. When the bread killed food, disease, and death, most medieval people didn't fear the taste of food. They feared what it hid. Because sometimes, it wasn't the hunger that killed you. It was the bread, or the water, or the blessing that went bad. Bread with a curse. Inside grain was life, but if it was stored damp or moldy, it became deadly. One of the most feared toxins was ergot, a fungus that infected rye. People who ate contaminated bread experienced burning skin, convulsions, delusions, blackened limbs, madness, death. Villagers called it St. Anthony's fire, but they didn't blame the fungus. They blamed sin, witches, demons, or God's punishment for a greedy harvest. Water. That betrayed water should be simple, but in medieval towns, it was often poison. Wells contaminated by waste. Rivers full of tannery runoff, latrines draining downhill into streams. And so people turned to ale, even children drank it. But when oil was brewed poorly or stretched too far with old ingredients, it became just as dangerous. One sip to survive, another to weaken, a third to fall ill. The invisible killers. There were no microscopes, no germ theory, only guesses. So when entire households fell ill after a feast, they blamed. Bad air miasma, angry saints, cursed hands in the kitchen. They wore amulets, hung herbs in doorways, prayed harder, but the sickness kept spreading. Food as a funeral guest. At its worst, food wasn't nourishment, it was a threat. And when famine came with disease, as it often did, villages shrank overnight. Bread went uneaten on cold tables, porridge cooled beside empty beds. And the next morning, another name was added to the prayer list. Bread and blood, when hunger became rebellion. For centuries, peasants were told that their hunger was holy, that suffering purified, that fasting brought them closer to God, that their empty plates were a test. But hunger, when stretched too far, changes shape. It stops looking like faith and starts looking like fury. The breaking point? It started with grain. When lords hoarded wheat during bad harvests. When bakers raised prices beyond reach. When monasteries locked their stores behind iron gates. The people snapped, not once, not twice, but over and over again. 1381, the peasants' revolt. England, summer, the grain fields have failed again. Wages were frozen by law, taxes rose to fund wars, and food scarcer than ever. Led by Wat Tyler and stirred by sermons of justice, tens of thousands marched toward London. They demanded fair wages, access to food, the right to feed their families without fear. It wasn't just a political rebellion, it was a hunger riot. The stolen loaf, the silent protest. Not all revolts were loud, some were quiet. A woman slipping a second loaf under her apron. A boy climbing into the Lord's orchard at dusk. A family poaching rabbits from the church forest. Each act small, each one illegal, but each a rebellion. Not against kings, but against empty stomachs. The cost of resistance, those caught faced. Pillories, flogging, imprisonment, or worse, being made an example. And yet, the stealing continued, because when your child hasn't eaten for 2 days, no law can silence your hands. Poisoned privilege. When the feast turned fatal from a distance, the noble banquet shimmered. Roast swans with gilded beaks, glazed fruits piled high on silver, wine flowing like rivers down long wooden tables. But underneath the wealth, something was rotting. The meat wasn't always clean. Rich lords loved meat. Beef, boar, goose, venison all seasoned with imported spice. But they didn't understand bacteria. They didn't have ice houses. And cooks, no matter how skilled, couldn't always smell what time had already ruined. Left too long, covered with sauce, served with ceremony, it still killed. The death of a king. In 1216, King John of England died suddenly while traveling. Some said it was from overindulgence, a feast of peaches, cider, and spoiled fish. Others blamed poison, but the truth may be simpler. He died from bad food. Even the crown couldn't protect him from what was on the table. Sweet doesn't mean safe. The nobility adored sugar. It was rare, costly, exotic. They used it to craft elaborate subtleties, edible sculptures that mimicked animals, buildings, or crests. But sugar masked spoilage, and sometimes it was laced with lead glazes on painted cakes or dishes. Indulgence came with a price, gluttony and disease. Excessive feasting led to gout, rotten teeth, obesity, digestive illness, early death. Some nobles died surrounded by food they could no longer eat. Their feasts became rituals not of nourishment, but of power. Theater, not sustenance for nobles. The meal wasn't about filling the belly, it was about display. Courses were served in sevens. Platters changed with each dish. Troops performed between bites. But no matter how gold the goblet, food that sits too long still spoils. And in the end, they too suffered, just more quietly, and with better wine. The bread was never just. Bread scarcity and the shaping of a worldview. In today's world, a loaf of bread is an afterthought. We toss it, freeze it, let it go stale. But in medieval Europe, bread was never just food. It was a prayer, a measurement of time, a symbol of status, a line between life and death. And the way people thought about food shaped how they thought about everything. Faith baked into the crust bread was holy. It was blessed. It was given as alms. It was broken at altars, sealed into icons, and even used in oaths. To waste bread was to insult God. Peasants crossed themselves before cutting it. Monks recorded its recipes like scripture. Mothers taught their children to kiss crumbs that fell on the floor. Bread was the body. Bread was sacred. Scarcity as a way of life. Most medieval families lived one failed harvest away from famine. That fear never left them. It influenced how they stored food, how they planted crops, how they prayed, how they treated strangers at the door. A single stale crust could become an act of mercy or a reason for theft. Scarcity was not an event. It was a lens. It shaped everything. Gratitude and guilt. Imagine growing up in a world where every bite you take was someone else's labor, and every scrap you threw away might have saved another. This constant awareness bred two things: deep gratitude, quiet guilt. Even among the wealthy, especially those who had once been poor, memory and inheritance expressed children raised on hunger did not forget. Even when they became adults or a fortune changed, they hoarded food. They feared waste. They taught their own children never to take full plates for granted. It was not about flavor. It was about fear. And that fear lived in the pantry, in the root cellar, in the quiet bite taken when no one was looking. 2 loaves, 2 live stories from the edge of the table. Let's stop walking through history and sit down beside it. Tonight, I'll tell you 2 stories, both about bread, but one ends in survival, the other in silence. Story 1, The Last Crust. Matilda had 3 children, 1 goat, and a small plot of land that hadn't yielded anything but weeds since the last frost. For weeks, her family had lived on barley porridge and prayers. But today, a traveling monk left a half loaf of rye bread at their doorstep, wrapped in cloth, still warm. She didn't eat it. She gave it to the youngest, the one who'd grown too quiet, and watched as his face lit up at the first soft bite. That loaf saved him. She didn't know it then, but it was the difference, not because it was food, but because it was a moment without fear. Story 2, The Quiet Room. Thomas was the second son of a carpenter. Not poor, not rich, just forgotten. When his father died in winter, there wasn't enough firewood, not enough flour, not enough of anything. His mother made a flat cake with old oats and the last onion in the cellar. She split it in 4. That night, he ate in silence. There was no talk, no tears, just the sound of chewing. By morning, his sister was gone, and Thomas never again looked at bread without remembering what it didn't save. A tale as common as cold. There are no records for these kinds of stories, no monuments, no names, but they happened every winter, every famine, every fast. Because in medieval times, hunger didn't always knock. Sometimes, it just stood in the corner and waited. The silence after hunger, a whisper from the past. We've walked through dirt paths and banquet halls, through broth too thin to feed a child, and tables too full to taste anything real. We've met people who stole to survive, and others who prayed over crumbs. But now, let's set all that down. Because even the harshest winter ends, and even in the Middle Ages, there were moments, small, fleeting, of peace. The garden returns. Spring never announced itself with trumpets. It came slowly. A sprout here, a fresh egg there. The first time someone smiled while eating again. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough. And enough, for a medieval peasant, was almost a miracle. The thread that remained, what they passed on, wasn't just grain techniques or stew recipes. They passed on the value of saving, the reverence for bread, the habit of sharing what little you have, the understanding that a full belly was the greatest wealth of all. And somehow, those threads reached us, in our pantries, in our caution, in the quiet guilt we feel when we let food go to waste. They're still with us, not in records or ruins, but in rhythm, in memory. Lay down the loaf tonight. You don't need to light the hearth. You don't need to hide a crust under your apron. You're safe, fed, warm. And somewhere, maybe, someone who came before you wished that exact peace for someone like you. A whisper to sleep, so rest now. The story has been told. The fields have gone quiet. The spoon has been set down. And the hunger is gone. We thank them not for what they ate, but for what they endured. And we remember,